All right, so we just finished classical conditioning. Now we're going to switch gears a little. We're going to talk about operant conditioning. And operant conditioning is just a type of learning where a behavior is strengthened or weakened, by the consequences that follow, whether those consequences, whether they're, rewarding or punitive. So again, we're just shaping behaviors via the consequences, desirable or undesirable consequences. So it was sort of put into a framework by B.F. Skinner, who was psychologist or behaviorist in the 20th century. So Skinner believed that behavior was influenced by the consequences, and that if we could manipulate the consequences, then we could in turn, shape or modify specific behaviors. And so while Skinner himself didn't really coin what we call the four quadrants of operant conditioning, positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement, positive and negative punishment, he did demonstrate them clearly in his experiments. And so one of Skinner's most famous experiments is with pigeons. So he placed hungry pigeons in a box in a small plot with a platform in the center, and the pigeons were trained to peck a small target on the platform. Whenever they pecked the target, they would receive a food pellet as a reward. So then Skinner introduced a light that would flash on one side of the box, indicating the direction in which the pigeon should move. And if the pigeon picked the target on the platform in the correct direction, it would receive a food pellet. And if it pecked in the wrong direction, it didn't receive anything. So over time, the pigeons learned to associate the flashing light with the direction that they needed to move, and they would peck the target accordingly. So Skinner found that the pigeons would exhibit various behaviors such as turning in circles, bobbing their heads in an attempt to really just kind of align themselves with the correct direction indicated by the light, so they would receive, the reward. In another one of Skinner's experiments, he placed a hungry mouse inside of a box, or a rat, and the box had a lever in it, and if the mouse pushed the lever, there was food in a water dispenser in there, and when the mouse would accidentally press the lever, just exploring the box, a food pellet would be dispensed into the tray, providing a reward for the behavior. And over time, the mice learned that pressing the lever would result in receiving food, and they began to press the lever more and more frequently. So this is just a good example of, positive reinforcement, which really just simply means adding something to the scenario that increases the likelihood or reinforces a behavior. So we're adding something that reinforces a behavior to the scenario. So this would be, positive reinforcement in kind of the quadrant, graph here. So Skinner also studied the effects of different reinforcement schedules, which we'll get into in another lesson later on. But for example, he found that when using variable ratio schedule with the levers, where the number of lever presses required for food kind of varied, that this led to like a higher rate of response from the mouse. And so the most resistant behaviors or more ingrained behaviors, a deeper learning experience. And in another of his experiments, he placed a rat in a box and delivered kind of a mild electrical stimulation to the floor of the box. And the rat would naturally try to escape the stimulation by exploring the box. And if the rat accidentally pressed the lever, the electrical stimulation would turn off and the rat would escape the stimulus. And over time, the rat learned that pressing the lever was a way to escape the stim. And as a result, the rat began to press the lever more frequently and quickly after being placed in the box. And so, it's just another good example of negative reinforcement, right? Which simply means removing something unpleasant from the scenario that in turn results in a behavior being more likely to recur. So here we have negative, removing something, and it's a reinforcement, so it increases the likelihood of behavior again. So negative reinforcement on the little graph over here. And this kind of quadrant is probably the most misunderstood or misrepresented quadrants really of all four. And it's pretty simple, really. Just remember that the reinforcing moment occurs when the stem's removed. So that's the learning moment. If the stem were to continue even after the rat pushed the lever, then the behavior of pushing the lever, it would have meant nothing. It would have had no gain and wouldn't have been of any value. So the pushing of the lever caused the removal of the stem, and that's what made it of value. Think in terms of economics or arithmetic, really, when you hear the term negative. And another clear and often used example is the seatbelt chime. When you buckle up, the chime's removed. When you push the button on the wake-up alarm, the nagging noise goes away, right? So the behavior of getting up and pushing the button is reinforced by the removal of the nagging noise. Now to positive punishment, right? Punishment is what the public or what non-trainers typically confuse with negative reinforcement. Positive punishment is a correction. It just occurs after disobedience. So when thinking of positive punishment, think in terms of economics again. It's adding, hence positive, something unpleasant to the scenario that makes the behavior less likely to reoccur. So we're adding something, but now we move down to the punitive or corrections, right? So positive punishment or correction. For example, you speed down the highway, you get a traffic ticket, and the ticket's a punitive penalty that's added to the scenario that makes you less likely to, go fast the next time. The timing of the ticket was after the disobedience. It wouldn't make sense to get penalized before disobedience or during. That would be impossible. And so then there's the last of the 4 quadrants, the negative punishment. And this simply means removing something from the scenario that makes the behavior less likely to repeat itself. So we're removing something from the scenario that makes the behavior less likely to happen again. So finally over here to negative punishment or correction, if you would. So for example, a child refuses to share one of his toys, so the parent takes the toy away. The behavior of not sharing was punished by the removal of the toy. And so this results in the child's stinginess being sort of less likely to reoccur, again, unless you have a hard-headed child. But we'll dive deeper into the differences of negative reinforcement, positive punishment, corrections, and aversives a little bit later. But that should suffice for now. So another key point to take note of is that in operant conditioning, it's necessary to begin with a spontaneous behavior, or in other words, a behavior that's not really induced by the rewards of bribery or the threat of punishment. The necessity of this can be confusing at first, so the simplest way I've found to explain it is to remember that the behavior is reinforced or corrected solely by the consequences, which by definition must come behind a behavior. So providing any type of reward or threat of punishment or correction before the behavior doesn't leave the shaping of the behavior up to the effects of the consequences. So if you have any questions on this, just jot them down and bring them to the private group and we'll discuss it a little bit more, but that's kind of how things go. Another thing to remember and consider is that while all these terms are kind of black and white as far as the definition, so to speak, in real life scenarios, there's often a gray area. Dogs don't think black and white all the time, right? So, but all these experiments demonstrated Skinner's concept that behavior is shaped and modified through the use of manipulated consequences. And that's really the point behind operant conditioning. So don't get too confused with it. Just remember that operant conditioning is simply shaping behaviors via the consequences, whether those consequences are desirable or undesirable, and that really there's kind of 4 major terms or ideas to remember with operant conditioning: positive and negative. Positive just means adding something, negative means removing something, and then reinforcement, and then punishment and correction. We consider punishment and correction in the POPO the same, which we'll talk more about later. But positive, adding, negative, taking away. Number 3, reinforcement means something that increases the likelihood of a behavior. And then number 4, a punishment or a correction just means something that decreases the likelihood of behavior. So this is kind of the common graph that you see everywhere when we're talking about operant conditioning. If you can remember this board, remember that typically, well, not typically, for a behavior to be truly operant, it has to be influenced by the consequences. So that being said, it needs to be a spontaneous behavior. So because it's affected, the behavior is reinforced or punished by the consequences that come after a behavior. So if anything is before the behavior that influences the behavior, then it's not really being operant completely. So again, there's some gray area there. It's not completely black and white, so don't get hung up on that. Just remember these 4 terms. It's shaping behaviors via the consequences. This is kind of the graph that makes it easy to remember. And then your 4 simple definitions there, or kind of key ideas with operant conditioning. So see you in the next lesson.